He would just go to like hotel.
And you see, every time I see somebody rolls their window down.
Yeah, it's because they feel guilty. I don't feel guilty. I can back it over my cape. All right. So in other words, what you have to do is you have to take, if you want to do that for a living, you have to take a course on sales. Entrepreneurial, because now basically you're your own business.
No, see, I'd work and get money, because I'd be out there with like one shoe and no sock, and the other like a sandal with a sock, tore up pants. I'd look the part. I'm not
So
gonna.
now you need an acting plan.
Yeah.
Which is still sales, you have to sell it.
Yeah.
All right, any questions? I would assume in micro they got a different book, I have no idea what the book is. Just follow somebody to their car. People go about it all wrong. One of the best stores in town is the parking lot at my college. Got a nice Rollins first baseman.
Red brick key?
What?
Red brick key? Open their doors for them?
No. He left the window open.
True.
A lesson. And he paid me in a Rollins first baseman. Keith Hernandez model. Although it was made in Taiwan. Wasn't the good leather, but it was so bad I broke into his car and put it back. This is bad. You don't even buy good gloves. All right. Any other questions? All right. What we want to do today is finish up the functioning of the nephron. All right, up to this point, we've kind of went over the general anatomy of the kidney, which basically boils down to the anatomy of the nephron. We said that the nephron is the basic structural and functional unit of the kidney. The kidney, in order to do what it has to do, it has to be hooked up to the bloodstream. It has to be hooked up to the blood supply. So we went through, in a general sense, I didn't go through every branch or every breakdown of the vascular system through the kidney, but we started with the renal artery. We eventually got down to the specialized vascular network that we have with the nephron. So that's a glomerulus, and we feed the glomerulus through a vessel called the afferent arteriole. And we saw that this is an area where we deviate from the normal vascular flow. The normal vascular flow goes artery, arteriole, capillary, venule, vein, and then in theory back to the heart. So here we're going artery, arteriole, capillary, which is the glomerulus. So the first three in the sequence is fine, but we do not drain the glomerulus, the capillaries, with a venule. We drain it with another arteriole. That is called the efferent arteriole. And then the efferent arteriole will then carry the blood to a second set of blood vessels, and these are called peritubular capillaries. So, beginning with the efferent arteriole going to a second capillary bed, that is a deviation from the normal vascular plane. Then, once we've gone through the peritubular capillaries, that is where tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion are going to get carried out. Then we go into the venous system, eventually to the renal vein, and then the cleanest blood in the body is going to be right in that renal vein, and then it mixes with the other blood in the inferior vena cava, and then to be circulated through the body. Okay? Now, why do we have two arterioles going into a capillary bed? We have two arterioles associated with the glomerulus because this will help in the filtering process. We learned, and this was in lab, that 3 processes needed to be carried out in order to produce urine. The first and foremost was glomerular filtration. Number 2 is the tubular reabsorption, and then number 3 is tubular secretion. First and foremost, the one that has to take place on a continual basis is glomerular filtration. In general, glomerular filtration, as its name states, is a filtering process. So we have these specialized capillaries. These are called fenestrated capillaries in the glomerulus, and they have pores. What the pores do is that they will allow the liquid component of blood, basically the plasma, water and what's dissolved into it, to leave the bloodstream and collect inside this capsule, Bowman's capsule. What the pores restrict going through are, number 1, cells. You don't want cells to wind up in the urine. So the pores restrict the movement of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets from getting into the urine. Number 2, the pores, and if you take a look at the architecture of the membrane, backtrack over here. All right, we got the endothelium, the pores, then the basement membrane will restrict things like proteins, large proteins, and then the innermost layer of the filtration membrane, which actually belongs to Bowman's capsule, has these cells. These are called podocytes. They will then further restrict things like small to medium-sized proteins from getting into the urine. So ultimately, the filtration process allows water and ions and some metabolic wastes to flow through that membrane, but it restricts cells and proteins. So on a normal urine sample, I should not have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets in the urine, nor should I have any protein in there. Because the proteins in the blood would include things like hormones, clotting proteins, transport proteins. They should not be lost through the urine because our body can use them. So the filtration membrane, which is the combination of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule, the renal corpuscle, ensures that filtration would occur. All right, now, why do we have 2 vessels, if you will, 2 arterioles entering and leaving the glomerulus? The reason why we can do that is because we can then control pressure. When we look at the process of filtration, filtration by definition is a movement of high pressure to low pressure. So molecules are moving from high pressure to low pressure. That's the definition of filtration. So sometimes if the pressure's too high, we're going to have to do things to reduce it to keep the filtration normal. And sometimes if the pressure is too low, we're going to have to do things to increase it to keep the filtration normal. So one way to attempt to do that is to have an arteriole feed into the glomerulus, into the capillary, and have an arteriole drain. When we take a look at the architecture of an arteriole, one of the key features of an arterial vessel wall is it contains smooth muscle. So by containing smooth muscle, we are able to, with the aid of chemicals or nerve impulses or what have you, we are able to increase the size of that arteriole space, or we can decrease it. So we can trigger through vasoconstriction or vasodilation a coordinated effort to keep the pressure, the filtration pressure, normal. The filtration pressure, the pressure required to force the waste products out of the blood into Bowman's capsule, okay, that has to be fairly consistent. It can go up a little, it can go down a little bit, but it has to remain fairly constant. The reason why it has to remain constant is because we have to filter a certain volume of blood at a certain rate of speed. In other words, we have to clean a certain volume of blood at a certain rate of speed to prevent the waste products from elevating too high. So the primary way that we control that is by controlling the pressure that generates the filtration process. So that's kind of what we want to look at here. Now, I'm not going to get over elaborate with it, but it's basically a modified version of Starling's law of the capillary. Now, we do not have a venous end of a capillary here, so that's why this is modified. But this basic mechanics that we see at the arterial end are going to be the same. All right, so if we just assume that the glomerulus, is a regular capillary bed, okay, and not worry about the pore size, we can then apply, very simply, Starling's law of the capillaries. When we take a look at the efferent arteriole, the afferent arteriole, the afferent arteriole will allow blood to flow into the glomerulus. Now, on my picture here, you can see that the afferent arteriole is larger in diameter than the efferent arteriole. So I have a large fluid input, but I have a relatively smaller fluid drainage. So what that means is more fluid gets into the glomerulus than is leaving. So that means there's a back pressure here. That back pressure inside the glomerulus helps to force the waste products out. The inherent pressure for this basically comes from our blood pressure. BHP, which stands for blood hydrostatic pressure. Simply stated, blood pressure. Much like we saw in Starling's law of the capillaries, the high pressure end of the artery, or the high pressure end of the capillary, the arterial side, was basically your blood pressure. So as long as we have a normal blood pressure, that starts the ball rolling for the filtering process. Okay? So the normal, and I'm just using the numbers that are on here, everybody uses different numbers, but the quantity, the actual value might change, but what is the highest in the various pressures is consistent. So by having a large afferent arteriole, a smaller efferent, we cause fluid to flow in under a certain amount of pressure. That pressure, as long as it's high enough, will force the material out of the glomerulus and get collected by Bowman's capsule. What gets collected by Bowman's capsule is the filtered fluid. We call it a filtrate. It's not quite urine yet, they just call it a filtrate. Now, there are some counter forces that are in, if you will, opposite direction of the blood pressure, capsular pressure, the osmotic pressures. All right, they will negate, they will cut into the blood pressure to lower it a little bit, but as long as the outward pressure is higher than the inward turning pressures, we will then have what is called a net filtration pressure. And that's what we want. You have to have a net filtration pressure. I don't care how we get it, we have to have it.
What did you say that was again?
The net filtration pressure is the pressure that is forcing the waste products out of the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule. So when you take your blood pressure reading, and then on the page here, on this picture here, it says it's 60. The capsular pressure tries to force the waste products from Bowman's capsule back into the bloodstream. Sounds counterproductive, but due to the architecture of this system, that's the way it works. If you think of Bowman's capsule as a balloon, it's going to fill up and expand. Well, it's going to reach its expansion point. So there's always, in a balloon, when it's full, there's always a compression force that's trying to force the air out of the balloon. Even though you're pushing the air in by breathing into the balloon is countering you by trying to force it out. And that's kind of what the capsular pressure is. As long as the blood pressure is higher than that capsular pressure, waste products will continue to leave. And then the osmotic pressure, that's because of the proteins that are in the blood. They try and hold on to that water, which is their job. So in other words, they're trying to retain the water in the waste products. Whatever the pressure that is, we have to overcome that. So the pressure that is formed when we overcome all of this stuff, that is called your net filtration pressure. It's lower than your blood pressure, but it still equals an outward force. And this is one reason why glomerular filtration is the most important of the processes. Because by definition, when you have filtered the blood, when the waste products have left the glomerulus and are now in Bowman's capsule or the nephron, they are by definition out of the blood. I have now just removed the waste products. Does that make sense? I have now just removed the waste products. So the blood that enters into that efferent arteriole is cleaner than the blood that entered or is traveling through the afferent arteriole. The blood in the efferent arteriole is cleaner, chemically cleaner than the blood in the afferent. Because by the time the blood has entered the efferent arteriole, the filtering process has removed a high percentage of the wastes. It's not perfect, we can do better, but that's your first step. So this first initial major cleaning process is completely pressure dependent. And initially, you look at it, well, it's derived from the blood pressure. Well, that winds up being a potential issue. Potentially. So we have to have some backup mechanism. And I'll get to those in a second. Any question on this, guys? So the filtering process in the glomerulus, glomerular filtration, relies on a pressure. The pressure is generated from the blood pressure, and as long as the blood pressure is of a certain value, that will force the waste products out of the blood into Bowman's capsule. It will create a filtrate. Now, we have to be able to adjust the filtration pressure and keep it constant no matter what the systemic pressure is doing. In other words, we have to continually clean the blood even though your blood pressure might be too high or too low. If the blood pressure, the blood hydrostatic pressure is too high, we run the risk of causing these capillaries to rupture. Or, and this is where high blood pressure gets you, you'll kill these filtering membrane cells. You'll kill these cells, and then scar tissue will form in here, and scar tissue doesn't filter blood very well. So that's why in high blood pressure, you wind up with nephrosclerosis. Anyone want to know the number one reason for renal failure and on dialysis? What?
Blood pressure?
Blood pressure. And it's usually that associated with diabetics. So your kidneys take a hit with high blood pressure. Okay? So we have to be able to adjust the filtering pressure independent of the systemic pressure. So studies have shown your systemic pressure can get very high, but the filtering pressure inside the glomerulus, inside the nephron, is going to stay fairly consistent. Your blood pressure can get very low. I don't know, let's say you down to, 5 gallons of Benadryl. Your blood pressure, systemic pressure would want to drop, but your filtering pressure in the kidney would stay fairly constant.
Like my dad has a really high blood pressure, and he says that his kidneys hurt like a lot. Is that why?
If his kidneys hurt,
Yeah, he said like back here always hurts. I don't know.
I don't know if there's any pain things in the kidney.
No, I don't know. I don't know if it does.
I would think there's something else going on.
So if you do have high blood pressure and you take something for it, is it still rough on your kidney?
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh.
You're just treating the symptoms. I have something with my eyes, but put my glasses on. Does that still mean my eyes are getting better? The blood pressure medication is just like wearing glasses.
Oh,
It's
fuck.
not going to reverse what the problem is.
So that would increase stroke and,
Yeah, potentially. All the blood pressure does is make it longer to get to that end result.
So how do you get kidney stones?
Call up Mick.
don't know.
How you get kidney stones?
Yeah.
That's usually pH related. That's chemical. You're causing
But then, like-
salts.
Does it form, so it forms in the kidney though?
Yeah. Yeah, it usually forms in the collecting ducts and stuff like that. Renal calculi, that's what that's called. So don't do math.
Someone brought in a picture of one that was like so huge, it looked like it was like kid-sized in this man that they had to do surgery on. It was off a stupid website. We had to do a renal presentation.
I don't think the kidney stone can get bigger than the kidney.
That's what I thought too,
That's
but
kookiness. And you know, if it's on the internet, it's absolutely true.
yeah.
So why can't,
Kid, what?
is that what, so why can't girls get kidney stones because of their short,
The
They
urethra?
can't.
yeah? They can't?
Yeah.
Girls can get kidney stones.
I didn't know.
They can get stoned.
They do some kind of
Well,
sound
anybody
waves
can
to
get
break them
stoned.
up.
Go to the bakery. Anybody can get stones. Usually the stones, it's causing something in the filtrate which is soluble to become insoluble, and then it crystallizes, it hardens, and that's where you get a stone. So that's why they gotta take a sample of it and chemically analyze it, because then they gotta figure, will I increase its ability to dissolve if I make the urine more acidic, or will I increase its ability to dissolve if I make the urine more basic? That's what they'll do. So as long as you stay hydrated, the chances are that that won't occur. All right, now, so how is the pressure within the glomerulus or within the renal corpuscle, how is that going to be regulated? And one way we can do that is by controlling, through vasoconstriction or vasodilation, controlling the diameter of the efferent and afferent arteriole. Here we have the smooth muscle. If the pressure in the system gets too high, I can cause the afferent arteriole to vasoconstrict, which will reduce the pressure inside the glomerulus. I have a smaller opening at which the pressure to go through. At the same time, I could dilate the efferent arteriole, which would lower the pressure on the exit portion of the glomerulus. So I've reduced the pressure going in, and I've reduced the pressure going out. I'm still filtering, but I've reduced the internal pressure because the pressure in the bloodstream, so when you took someone's blood pressure, it would be high. So I've maintained normal pressure inside the kidney, thus I've maintained normal filtration. If for some reason the pressure started to drop, I could vasodilate the afferent arteriole. That will allow more fluid in, and I could vasoconstrict further the efferent. So that would increase the back pressure. So even though the systemic pressure in your arms and legs has dropped, the normal filtering pressure inside the kidney has been maintained. It's been maintained. So through this, controlling the afferent-efferent arteriole diameter, we can control the pressure. And this is based on the same principle we learned when we went into resistance. What were the 4 V's of resistance?
Viscosity, volume,
Vessel diameter. What's the one that is most, has the greatest effect on resistance? What? Diameter. I'm not going to be able to change the viscosity of the blood anytime quick through here, but I can change the diameter. So we're just following the same basic rules of blood pressure, but here we're applying it in a very specific way to control the filtration here. So by controlling vessel diameter of the afferent arteriole and efferent arteriole, the net result in between them is normal filtration pressure, normal filtration of current. Now, that only can work so far. I mean, if your blood pressure is so high, it's off the charts, this isn't going to be able to counter that very effectively. Or if it's so low, there's only so much vasoconstriction or dilation will carry. Okay? If it's so low that blood isn't flowing, well, then you're going into shock. And that's one reason why you've got to prevent them from going into shock, is because now you've stopped filtering the blood. Now waste products are retained. So someone who's going into anaphylactic shock or vascular shock, you have to up your blood pressure, because now their ammonia levels and stuff are starting to retain in the blood. Okay? So that's what, yeah.
This is an unrelated question, kind of. People who have high blood pressure, why do they say they have like ringing in their ears then?
Tinnitus. Because of the high pressure, the vasculature in the brain. All right, now, the kidneys are also involved not only in controlling their own intrinsic pressure, which is called autoregulation. The kidneys are also involved to some degree in working on systemic pressure, because after all, we said they are part of the long-term blood pressure controlling organs. They are involved in controlling systemic pressure to a point as well. And they do this working with the endocrine system. And again, this falls under the autoregulatory heading. The kidney, okay, when you get down to the nephron and the vascular level here, has a network of cells within the nephron and the afferent-efferent arteriole. These networks of cells work as a team. We call this network the juxtaglomerular apparatus. for the juxtaglomerular complex. Apparatus and complex meaning same thing. Question? So what are the parts of the juxtaglomerular complex? All right. The first part of the juxtaglomerular complex is this specialized network of cells within the distal convoluted tubule. And these are called, this network of cells is called the macula densa. So that's part number one to the complex. Complex means it's got a bunch of parts working together. All right, so these macula densas in the distal convoluted tubule. The next group of cells, the next part to this juxtaglomerular complex, are these specialized smooth muscle cells within the afferent and, although not on the picture, sometimes in the efferent arteriole. These are called juxtaglomerular cells.
Sometimes you can hear it.
Yeah, but mainly it's the afferent. What this complex of parts and cells is doing, it is monitoring how much, basically how much fluid is flowing through the nephron in order to control blood pressure.
Will you repeat that one?
Yeah. This system is monitoring the fluid flowing through the nephron as a way of controlling blood pressure. All right, so here's our afferent arteriole. So that means fluid flows into the capillary, and then waste products and fluid flow out. And then here we have the efferent arteriole. Now this fluid that's flowing out is now going to get into the tubular system. Eventually it's going to get to the distal convoluted tubule. This fluid is now going to work its way and travel through this tubule. So that means what's going to happen is that fluid is going to flow past that macula densa. Macula means spot, dense is dense. Dense spot. The cells are tightly compressed together. So let's say this is the macula densa right here. So the fluid flows past it. What the macula densa is doing, it's monitoring, it's counting the number of sodium molecules that flow past it. The macula densa cells are programmed genetically to know what a normal amount of sodium should be within that flow of urine. The macula densa cells know how much sodium should be in that flow of urine. through the nephron. The sodium is a marker for how much fluid is being filtered at any given point. So if the sodium, the number of sodium molecules that the macula densa counts goes down, the macula densa will assume we are not filtering enough fluid in the glomerulus. Does that make sense?
You said if there's not enough sodium?
Yeah, the sodium is a marker, it's an indicator. Because as long as I'm filtering at a certain rate of speed, I should be sending in to the tubule a certain amount of sodium. If I decrease the filtering, the amount of sodium getting into the tubule will drop. If I increase it, the amount of sodium getting in should increase. Does that make sense? The sodium is just a marker. So what the macula densa is doing, it's counting the number of sodium molecules that flow by. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And it's going to do that for a period of time. Okay? 100 sodium molecules floated by within this time frame, everything's good. That must mean we are filtering a certain amount of fluid at the front end of this. But then another period of time goes by and they see the counters, the macula densas, they say, you know, within this time frame, I only saw 40 sodium molecules. So the macula densa then will assume, well, if you only counted 40 sodium molecules when we should normally have 100, that must mean we are not filtering enough fluid up front. So they now have to send a signal to increase the filtering process. So in other words, they have to increase the pressure. So what the macula densa will do, they will send a signal to these juxtaglomerular cells. The juxtaglomerular cells, they will then release a hormone called renin. Renin, which is released by the kidney, will then get into the blood, and basically it's going to react with a hormone from the liver called angiotensinogen. Angio? What's angio, you med-term people? Vessel, like an angiocat, angiography, vessel. Tensin, pressure, ogen, precursor. So what will happen, renin mixes with angiotensinogen, and then this mixture goes to the lungs, you don't have to know this detail, and it basically creates the hormone angiotensin.
So the kidney releases this?
Yep, that's why it's called renin, renal, renin.
Oh, what about those cells? They don't release?
Who?
The juxtaglomerular.
Well, where are they?
over the 8.
They're in the kidney, yeah. Glomerular kidney, they're in there, okay? So renin gets secreted, mixes with some other chemicals, and eventually, by working with the liver and the lungs, we form a hormone called angiotensin. Angiotensin will now, out into the vascular system, cause the arterioles in the periphery to constrict. That will then basically, the end of all of this, elevate the systemic pressure. So by elevating the blood pressure, we would then in turn elevate the filtration pressure. This is called the angiotensinogen, renin-angiotensin system. So if there's something wrong with this, this is what can lead to a condition called renal hypertension. There is a whole group of medications that basically stop this process from working. Those group of medications are called ACE inhibitors. Anyone ever heard of them? ACE inhibitors are angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors. In essence, what they do is that they prevent the formation of angiotensin. So now your blood pressure won't go up. Because there are individuals whose heart rate is fine, they don't need diuretics, they don't need, but yet they have their blood pressures up. So they can do a blood test and they see, oh, you've got elevated renin levels. There is a subset of individuals that will have elevated renin levels. So those individuals are candidates for this medication because by having high renin levels, that will lead to high angiotensin levels, which will then cause your blood pressure to stay too high. And that high pressure over time will kill the kidneys. So when you go back to that list of functions that I gave for the renal system, notice how intimately controlled, or intimately involved, I should say, the kidneys are in with blood pressure control. So generally when someone has malfunctioning kidneys, they're going to have difficulty controlling blood pressure.
Either way.
Either way. Yeah. Because the kidneys can do things if it's too high, and they can do things if it's too low. But if the kidneys are shot, they can't do anything. Now you're relying not only on the heart to adjust, but now blood vessels, and that can only go so far. Because notice that this is working on both the fluids. The kidneys work on two things. When we looked at peripheral resistance, I said that 2 of the V's belong to what fluid? Blood. 2 of the V's belong to what structures? Vessels. Notice the kidney's working on both of them. It's controlling blood volume, hence viscosity, so it's working on those, and now it's controlling vessel diameter. The heart can only do one thing. It creates the pressure. It doesn't go a whole long way to control it, because it's still got to pump blood. So the kidneys take care of that. And the reason being is, in order for the kidneys to effectively clean the blood, they rely on a certain amount of blood pressure to cause that filtering process. So if that filtering process is too low, kidneys got to say, I got to clean the blood, so I'm going to do things to make the filtering process increase, and the best way I can do that is by elevating or controlling blood pressure. Yeah.
I was gonna say, do you think someone with low blood pressure would help if they would eat more sodium, higher salty stuff?
If they had low blood pressure, but if they already have normal volume and they have low pressure, that's not necessarily going to make the situation better. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because then you're going to offset something else. It just might be their inherent, usually what they'll give them is vasoconstrictors. They'll give them something to make it that way. And the other way, they can give you vasodilators to lower it. Generally, the low blood pressure is not a problem. As long as you're producing urine, you're generally fine. And you're awake. Okay? The high blood pressure over time becomes more of an issue. Okay? I don't care about the other stuff here. Basically, this renin-angiotensin system helps to control systemic pressure, but the kidney also has a way of controlling its own internal pressure. So all of this control that the kidney has in order to control its own function, they call that auto-regulation. The kidney can auto-regulate its own pressure in order to function correctly. It does not rely on other areas of the body to control it. The kidney takes an active role. All right, so this is just kind of a generalized flow chart for that juxtaglomerular complex. Okay? All right, so that takes care of the basics on filtration and how we are able to control it. The next process we want to, and I'm not going to go into the biochemistry on this.
Thank you.
The next process we look at here, just to kind of get an idea of what's going on, is tubular reabsorption. What is the basic mechanics on how we reabsorb the fluid? As I mentioned in lab, we will send approximately 180 liters of fluid through our kidneys in 24 hours. But I'm sure you are aware of, we do not urinate out 180 liters of fluid. The normal average urine output is going to be somewhere between 1 and 2 liters. So basically 1.5 quarts a gallon a day. So that means the other 168 or so liters have to get out of the kidney and return to the blood. And that's basically what tubular reabsorption is. Returning material from the nephron back to the bloodstream. And this is the basic mechanical framework on how that occurs. Okay? It's basically a series of chemical reactions that lead to the activation of certain biotransport processes. But there's a couple of key things here, so that's what I want you to focus on. There has to be one thing that starts this reabsorption process. There's got to be one step, there's one thing, one key feature that causes this thing to go. The key feature that causes us to retain the fluid and, reabsorb the fluid is seen right here, and that is sodium. Sodium is the key to all of this reabsorption. Now, last week when we went over, had gone over body fluids and electrolytes, we went over intracellular fluid compartment, we went over extracellular fluid compartment. And I pointed out on a graph what was the most abundant extracellular fluid ion. What was that?
I know it wasn't the plasma in the blood, I know it. God, I know it.
Not in the fluids. Calcium most abundant in the body, but that's in bones. Flow, I'm talking fluid.
Oh, man.
Sodium?
Thank you. Sodium. Sodium is the most abundant extracellular cation. And there's a rule in biochemistry that says if you're the most abundant ion in the fluid, you have the greatest effect on osmosis. You have the greatest hold on water. So in other words, wherever you go, water will follow. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So since now this is primarily in the proximal convoluted tubule, but it occurs elsewhere. But they're shown, my picture is showing proximal convoluted tubule. At the cells that form the tubule, they're basically up against those peritubular capillaries. So what these tubular cells do is that they have a sodium-potassium ion pump, an exchange pump. And what they will do is that they will start pumping sodium within their cytoplasm. They will start pumping it back into the blood. So the fact now that sodium gets pushed into the blood, that will pull sodium in from the urine. So, now that sodium has been extracted from the urine, what's going to follow? Water. Okay? Now, since this is a pump moving the sodium, I'm using ATP for that. So I'm using ATP to pull sodium in from the urine back into the blood. But water flows all by itself. It's just going to follow. It's going to follow the sodium. As a result of water, what's ever dissolved into it will now flow with the water. So other ions, more sodium, more potassium, and they're just going to flow as well. So this is like the Pied Piper with the rats. Okay? Pied Piper's playing that thing, he's working, and the rats just follow him. Okay? So, and we actually even reabsorb, believe it or not, some of the waste products that we want to get rid of, but it's just the nature of the mechanism. As long as we get rid of more than we pull back in, we're fine. Okay? We call this mechanism by which we pull in the water passively and what's dissolved in it, okay, this is called solvent drag.
What is that again?
Solvent drag. Solvent drag is, well, what's a solvent? Okay. But why is the cleaner called a solvent? Chapter 3.
It's dissolved in water?
What?
Because it's dissolved in water?
What's the difference between a solvent and a solute?
The solvent dissolves in solute.
A solvent dissolves the solute. So when we learned about osmosis, because I know those of you who had me, we had this. Dr. Ryan, that was back in chapter, well, I don't remember chapter.
Pretty much, yeah.
That was chapter 3 with osmosis. So when I want to make a solution, I have to have a solvent, and I have to dissolve a solute, and I combine them, and I have a solution. So if I want to make a salt solution, I take water and pour salt in it. Water is the solvent, salt is the solute. So if I'm pulling the water, because it's following sodium, the salts or the electrolytes that are in that are going to flow along with it. So in other words, I'm reabsorbing the solvent, which is dragging the salts back along with it. Does that make sense? That's why it's called solvent drag. I'm reabsorbing the water, that's the solvent, and what's ever dissolved in it is going to go with it. It's going to be dragged along. It's like the kids and the parents. Wherever the parents go, the kids get dragged along. And that's the word you use. I got to drag those f***ing kids around. I don't want to be dragging them through the mall. You mean I have to drag them through me with the store? I love that phrase, drag. It is what it sounds like.
Times the skag.
Yes, drag skag. I got to drag these skags? I don't want to drag these kids around all over the freaking countryside. Because the word drag just means extra work. It's a burden. All right? So what the key thing to this is getting the sodium to go. If you don't do that to sodium, water won't automatically just go into from the urine back into the blood. It has to follow the most abundant ion in the fluids, and that is sodium. So once we pull the sodium back in, and not all of it, we're not pulling every drop of it in, you're still going to get rid of some. But once we use energy to do that, everything else just follows passively through this solvent drag. I'll make the blanket statement, everything else. Someone's going to come, not everything, Dr. Ryan, I read in a book. Not everything, but most things will then passively flow. So it's a very efficient process. I spend energy to remove one ion, one electrolyte, and then all the other stuff that I want to retain follows along with it. I don't spend any energy on those. So tubular reabsorption occurs because of the key event is the sodium pump. That sodium-potassium pump, pumping it from the tubule back into the blood. That's the key. That is the absolute key feature here. Everything else just follows. In essence, solvent drag is just basically osmosis. It's just basically osmosis. Now, you can counterbalance that, or you can screw this up if you just create stronger osmosis in the urine. Well, Dr. Ryan, that's confusing me. No, I'm not. Because look what else is in the urine. Right, you had Glenn-Close, now you got glucose. That was a good one. Right now. You have glucose in here. Okay? Glucose, when it reaches a certain quantity, will have a stronger pull on the water than the sodium mechanism. So if a diabetic doesn't take their insulin, the glucose will go from the blood into the urine. The high quantity of glucose will now leave, and it will pull water with it. So we're going to lose more water than we're reabsorbing through solvent drag. So quote unquote in diabetes, I have to pee a lot. That is called osmotic diuresis. That's called osmotic diuresis. And the problem with that is you're losing more water. You know, they'll say, well, they're diabetic, they're thirsty. They're losing more water than they're taking in. So when their blood glucose levels gets very high, one of the problems is they go into a very dehydrated state. They call that a hyperosmotic state. The blood's sludge and thick and it affects the heart and everything. And then they're going into acidosis at the same time. Probably not good. I'm guessing it's not good. I can enhance this with certain chemicals. And there's a chemical. They'll use this process. They'll override this process if they think that the condition you have warrants kind of drastic measures. How good is cerebral edema for you? Let's say you have a head injury and your brain is swelling inside your frickin' skull. Probably not good. I'm guessing. Okay, so now you got cerebral edema. What I have to do is I have to cause your body to get rid of more fluid to get that brain to shrink. But I gotta do it carefully and relatively slowly. So what they will give you a chemical called inulin. Not insulin, inulin. Inulin is a type of sugar that we don't metabolize. So the kidney tries to get rid of it through the urine. Inulin pulls massive amounts of water with it. So when people that have a head injury and cerebral edema, in their IV, they'll give them inulin, and as the kidney gets rid of it, it will pull massive amounts of water with it. That's called osmotic diuresis.
Isn't that what happened with that skier?
Oh,
That you always talked about?
Natasha Kansky?
Yeah. Her, and then her brain was swollen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they tried doing that, but too little, too late to never try again.
Because she didn't go to the hospital earlier to get that medication.
Yeah, she didn't go. So her head swelled. I think she wound up with a subdural hematoma. So there's probably some swelling associated with that. Hers was more bleeding. But an actual insult to the brain, like a, those football player injuries where the guy gets hit and he's, all of a sudden goes into a coma. Their brain can swell so their cerebellum sticks through the foramen magnum down into their spinal canal. Now, is that freaking cool or what? They call those the cerebellar tonsils. They're hanging out. So they'll do that for people with those types of head injuries where they have a massive concussion which causes swelling. So not necessarily bleeding, but swelling.
So why don't they do that to babies? Because I got a cousin that was born like that, and we still
Are their kidneys functioning?
We still, yeah,
Yeah.
but we still call him waterhead. Yeah, I mean, because he was born with water on the brain.
Well, he had hydrocephalus.
But his head never, his body like finally caught up with his head. But you can still tell like he's got some type of deformation.
Usually put a shunt in.
Yeah, he has a shunt, but it's still,
Well, that's different than cerebral swelling, cerebral edema.
but he was born like that.
That's a buildup of fluid, CSF, within the spaces on the outer surface. It's not actually within the brain tissue.
So it's just sitting on the side.
Sitting on the outer side, yeah, it takes up room, which crushes the brain. That's the problem.
But you would think it would just leave, so medicine like that.
No, that's got its own circulation, so.
This just reminds me of what my sister's friend has. She has
Step is admittance.
and they were talking about putting a shunt in, but she had to lose weight first, and to see if that would help fix it, and it stopped the.
Because sometimes it's adipose.
Yeah.
So you can pretty much,
Yeah. What?
so you can pretty much fix all head injury, I mean, not all of them, but like if there's
Well,
swelling.
that's not saying, I'm not repairing damaged cells, I'm just getting rid of the swelling.
So they could still live with it, but I mean, there would be some damage, like, say a part of the brain gets damaged or something because of whatever happened, but you can still reduce the swelling so they don't actually like, just die.
So they don't die. That's what you're reducing swelling for, so they don't die. They'll die later, but not right now. And they might not be able to put Velcro together after they do it. Like Crackhead Bob trying to sing I Got You, Babe. All right, so that's the basic mechanics of tubular reabsorption. And obviously, as you can see, there's a fair amount of biochemistry with that. I just can't give you the main thing. How that occurs, that's where the biochemistry. We're just saying we reabsorb sodium, water follows, and whatever dissolved into it gets pulled back in as well. Solvent drag. All right, tubular secretion. In tubular secretion, basically what happens with tubular secretion, this is a way that we basically get rid of excess acids out of the body. It's a way to fine tune the pH. We can get rid of some medications that way. Acids. This kind of gives you an outline of what's reabsorbed and stuff like that as you go through. I'm just blanket statementing everything. All right, so tubular secretion, relatively compared to filtration and reabsorption, not as important. It is important, you won't do great. It's just a way of making sure that we can fine tune the pH really of the blood. So if for some reason you decided to drink a gallon of orange juice, the normal filtering process would not be sufficient enough to get rid of all that citric acid. So we have a backup plan, tubular secretion, to get rid of a little bit extra so that way the pH doesn't drop significantly. But under normal circumstances, the normal filtering should get rid of most of the acids, at least the metabolic acids. Through dietary stuff like that, we might take in more, so we kind of have a backup plan to do that. So collectively, when you put all of those things together, filtration, reabsorption, secretion, that results in a normal urine sample. Now, once the urine is produced, once it has left the nephron, there's no more treating it. It is what it is. So from there, we basically go from the kidney, we will then go down into the ureter, and then eventually that fluid's going to fill up in this structure here, and this is the bladder. So this is what the bladder looks like if it was see-through and you were seeing it get filled up with urine. And now they have commercials where the bladder is a dog. And it's just carrying you all over the place.
That's the cutest bladder I've ever seen.
I just went! And then the lady sitting at the restaurant, and these eyes
The
pop
big
up, and
blue
it's the
eyes,
freaking bladder sitting there looking at her. Who the hell came up with this? I was halfway through a bottle of Cavassier, and I had to stop because I saw this bladder. Put the cork back in. I had to go to something lighter. So oh my God. Because what the bladder is a holding tank. It's a cistern, which just holds the urine for a while, so that way it's not constantly leaking. Now, the way the bladder works, the bladder will fill by way of the ureters, and it's going to cause the bladder to expand. As the volume increases, the bladder will expand. Within the wall of the bladder, we have pressure receptors, baroreceptors. They're monitoring how much pressure is put on the wall by the urine. When the bladder expands or reaches a certain pressure, those receptors will fire into the spinal cord, and then it will send an impulse up to the brain. The impulse that reaches the brain reaches the conscious center, which then tells you consciously your bladder's full. The conscious center then goes to the decision-making area and says, what do you want to do? Do you want to drink? Do you want to void now? Or do you want to void later? Now, if you're a newborn, that decision is not going to be made for you. In a newborn, what you have is called the micturition reflex. The same thing's going to occur. Bladder's going to fill up, sends an impulse in through those receptors, and it will send an impulse to the brain, but that thing has no idea what that thing is telling it. So what will happen is the reflex will occur. It'll send a motor response back out to the bladder. The bladder has this layer of smooth muscle in its wall, and that muscle is called the detrusor muscle. I just love that, detrusor. Det. So they had a bladder control medication. I think they do. It's called Detrol. Detrol. So what someone did, I love marketing. Someone took, well, we have detrusor and we have control. They both have TR in there, so let's overlap them and we can make a word. Detrol. Detrusor control. Dun, 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 dun. So what happens is, what that medication will do, it will stop the detrusor from contracting reflexively. So you'll retain the urine. And that's what that new trimetric or Bactric, whatever the medication is. Okay? Now, we have learned to control the bladder, and that control mechanism is down here on the urethra. On the bottom of the urethra, we have two sphincters, two circular muscles to control draining the bladder. One of them is smooth muscle, and then the next one in line is skeletal muscle. Well, if it's skeletal muscle compared to smooth muscle, which one is voluntary? Skeletal. So even though the bladder says I'm full and I want to empty, and it's contracting, the brain, here's where the brain says, it says, do you want the bladder to empty now? You're stuck in traffic. There's no backup after this, there's just towels. So we will send an impulse down to the skeletal muscle sphincter, the external sphincter, and contract it. So even though the bladder and that smooth muscle sphincter has relaxed, we'll retain the fluid. So it then kind of goes back up and waits. But remember, it's still being filled. It's still filling up. So it says, okay, I'll give you a little bit of time. I'll give you about 10 minutes. I'll give you about 10 minutes. And then all of a sudden, you're going to have another contraction again. It's going to send the pressure back up to brain. Brain says, okay, now, are we near the exit? Or are we still stuck in traffic? And then the more full this gets, the more annoying those things in the back seat are. Shut up! The more full that gets, the more annoying the radio is. So we turn the radio off. The more full that gets, the less you can read the signs. I missed the freaking exit, I gotta go so bad. The more full that gets, the longer that arm gets. If I reach you, I swear to God, buddy, I'm gonna pull you. The more full that gets, the less details you hear. Mom, what's this with the square root of 25? Don't bother me now! The coach says I gotta work. Don't bother me now! That's what happens when you got a full bladder. So we learn to control it by controlling it's called the external sphincter because it's skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle. So this has to squeeze tighter than that can contract. So in the, the trimetric thing, what that does is that it slows down the contraction or decreases contraction of the urinary bladder. So you'll retain the stuff longer. But the side effect is you're retaining it longer. And it says that you got to tell your doctor if you have stopped urinating. That means the bladder's filling up, but you're not emptying it. You're going to have to do something different. Because that fluid will build up, it'll fill up the ureters, and then it's going to back into the kidney, and that's called hydronephrosis, and that can kill the kidney. Urology, big business. Big business. There's all types of garments with people dancing, all on the TVs now. We've got digitally enhanced bladders on leashes. We've got family scenarios where they have to stop while they're taking the kid back to college, and this is like the 5th time we've stopped, I have to go! Then they've got people with espionage plans. Okay, ladies, we have a bathroom here, here, and here. So, because they're in some meeting, And these are just the commercials. And who are they centered around? Yeah, guys generally don't have this problem. If guys can't go, it's because they've got this thing here, the prostrate. That'll enlarge, and then it's going to close off that, and now we can't empty. Bad design. Bad design. See, guys have what is called a urogenital system. They combine their reproductive system with the urinary system. Girls don't. Girls don't. They have a different system. Theirs is separate. And in order to be efficient, this is what they do. But that's the way it works.
And girls always have to wait for a bathroom, guys can just go outside.
Yep. Yep. What?
Unfair.
Have you heard of the shy bladder? When you,
Shy bladder?
yeah, like if
That's
you
a
go-
song by David Lee Roth. Shy bladder, shy bladder. Yeah, shy bladder. That's called shy boy. Shy boy, shy boy. But I like bladder better.
Wow.
What is shy bladder?
Well, you have to go, but you get in there and then you can't go.
Yeah.
Like stage fright.
Yeah, or like, you know, if you're in the bathroom and there's a whole.
Oh. That reminded me when I applied to the Navy medical program for Marines, and I had to give a urine sample. So I'm in wherever they recruit these people, this big gym, everyone's walking around buck naked. And we have to go into this room, and they have to watch you pee into the cup. So you go behind this fold-out thing, and there's this Marine standing there like this, you know, looking straight ahead with the hat and everything. And he's like, "Gentlemen, line up." So 5 of us go, and there's 5 cups on the table. And he goes through this procedure. You will take your right hand, you will take the cup off the table, you will place it in the appropriate anatomical position, and you will drain, and you have to get enough fluid past this line. And so we're standing there, and all of a sudden, you know, this guy's just watching you. And he counts off your name, he goes name, and he checks off, okay, that you're who you are. And then you're standing there watching, and this one guy next to me goes, and he's, "I got 1 little Indian," and then I go, 2 little Indians. So the 5th guy is like, "I can't go while you're looking at me." And he says, "Son, you're holding up the United States Marine Corps. You're done." And he kicked him out. Oh my God. Son, you're holding up the United States Marine Corps. Oh my God. And we couldn't laugh. You know, we're sitting there adjusting, and we're just like, "Oh my God." Because then we had to go out and get the prostates checked.